The way the media has been covering the battle in Bakhmut is under fire from conservatives. A tweet from the media account DC Drano, run by Rogan O'Handley, who's a Turning Point USA ambassador, reads this: "They don't want you to know that Russia taking Bakhmut was a devastating loss. Notice how Biden is now planning to send F-16s to Ukraine. That's not a sign of winning. It's clear desperation after the U.S. dumped $100+ billion into a foreign country instead of helping Americans." Author of Bottom Up newsletter on Substack, David Sachs, tweeted yesterday, "What is the significance of Bakhmut? Here's what the MSM should be telling you. Firstly, that its regional transport and logistics hub, Bakhmut gives Russia access to key roads and rail. It places larger cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk within easy range of Russian artillery. Hence Zelensky's earlier comment that the loss of Bakhmut would give the Russians an, quote, open road to the rest of the Donetsk." He continued, "Unique defensive fortifications, Bakhmut's network of subterranean salt mines and tunnels, 100+ miles, contributed to its defensibility. It also provides an underground complex to stockpile weapons, munitions, and equipment. Ukraine has other lines of defense, but Bakhmut may have been unique."
Sachs also wrote, Bakhmut became a rallying cry for Ukrainian resistance. Zelensky called it, quote, the fortress of our morale, and gave a Bakhmut flag to the U.S. Congress when he visited. He said the fight for Bakhmut will change the trajectory of our war for independence and for freedom. Russia may have used Bakhmut as a trap to lure in Ukrainian troops and generals, causing them massive casualties and imperiling the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Prigozhin videos claiming the Russians were running out of ammo, which were equally reported by the mainstream media, may have been a part of that trap. Yeah, I saw a lot of people on the left actually talking about this New York Times piece that came out over the weekend. Of course, as we said, there in the lead up was a lot of significance placed on Bakhmut by Ukraine. Bakhmut having fallen, the title of the New York Times piece is, "As Russia claims victory in Bakhmut, Ukraine sees opportunity among ruins." I read the article. It wasn't clear to me what the broader opportunity was. The article repeatedly downplays the loss. Here's from the article. But the city is now in ruins, and controlling it would not necessarily help Moscow toward its larger stated goal, conquering the entire eastern region of Donbass, refuting all of the strategic purposes of the region that was laid out in the David Sachs tweet. It is hard to miss the pivot that has been undertaken by the media on this one now that Bakhmut has, in fact, fallen under Russian control.
Yeah, that's some copium. The New York Times, that was from a few days ago, I think.
Yeah,
and they have another one of these stories from yesterday. Russia, it's a very similar headline and framing. Russia claims Bakhmut, but some see a Pyrrhic victory, one of those victories that is so costly it's absolutely a loss. The subhead is thousands of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers died there, but the cost for Moscow was especially steep. Why was it especially steep for Moscow? Moscow has more soldiers than Ukraine. Yes, I'm sure it was a devastating number of losses. They're estimating 20,000 killed, 100,000 Russians wounded. Yeah. But again, Russia has vastly more forces. So I'm sure Ukraine did not give it up easily, by all indications. The Russians lost a lot. The city has been reduced to rubble, so that does reduce its strategic value a little bit. But I mean, Ukraine is trying to claim more and more territory across the country.
Right.
It's not if it can't occupy a city that still has people in it. I mean, that's not the end of the world for the Russian perspective. They're killing a lot of Ukrainians. I mean, it's very sad. This war needs to end. People are dying left and right on both sides. But you're being, we in the West, it's almost like we're being spun to think that things are going well for Ukraine.
Always.
Things aren't going well for anyone because lots of people are dying and there's no end in sight to this conflict. But Ukraine is not about to recapture its entire country, march into Russia, and overflow Vladimir Putin. That's just not realistic.
Yeah, the framing of the casualty numbers is interesting from a historical perspective. Russia lost more soldiers than anyone during World War II. They still won the war. That sacrifice is perhaps the but-for cause of the West, of the Allies winning World War II. So, I mean, it is kind of like a missing the forest for the trees kind of a framing. A little lower down in the article I was reading from before, a Russian a Ukrainian colonel, Suri Habersky, said on Ukrainian news media that the Russian capture of Bakhmut will mean nothing, actually. The Russians have exhausted their offensive capabilities. That's why they're so desperate to declare they have captured Bakhmut. I mean, that would land better if there hadn't been statement after statement, report after report about what Ukrainians saw and the value of Bakhmut, and framing of Ukrainian successes and Bakhmut as indicative of broader successes in the war. It's also worth noting, Trita Parsi, frequent guest of this show, of the Quincy Institute, foreign policy expert, observed this morning, he thinks that something is happening. He said, quote, Europeans are talking about peace talks, negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, and even mentioned India, Brazil, and China in those talks. Just a few weeks ago, that was treated as treasonous. And it's interesting that perhaps some realities on the ground have led to a change in tone in negotiations. Remember, just last summer, the end of last year, there was a huge blow up among progressives because there was just a suggestion in a letter to have peace talks. Now it seems like that might be a real reality.
I mean, there will be talks eventually.
Yeah.
The question is how many people have to die before there are realistic talks about Russia getting something it wants so that the rest of Ukraine can be protected against future aggression. That's how it will end. The question is when. The question is how many more cities have to suffer the fate of Bakhmut until we get to that point. Meanwhile, writer Caitlin Johnson tweeted over the weekend that the U.S. has just signed off on both F-16s for Ukraine and attacks on Crimea using U.S.-made weapons, both of which have drawn dire warnings from nuclear-armed Russia, and both of which would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. Right, we're continuing down the same course of unlimited financial support resources to Ukraine at the risk of being drawn into a more obvious and more direct confrontation with Russia, a nuclear-armed power, bringing us to the precipice of World War III. How many times do we have to say, this does not seem like a good idea?
Yeah, it is confusing. I mean, there seems to clearly, I think, been a shift from we'll fight to the last Ukrainian to I guess we have to be open to negotiations. But weapons keep getting sent. There have been stories about an incredible grift with the arms industry, where people have noted that over the course of decades, the price of various kinds of equipment has skyrocketed. The cost that the arms companies are charging the government is going up and up. They're keeping enormous shares of profits. There are people that are earning a great deal off of this war, as thousands of Ukrainians and Russians are dying in these horrific battles. And, it is frustrating that there aren't more mainstream calls for peace in either party, to be honest. The blob is still blobbing strong, and we'll continue to follow and see if there's any more significant shifts over what happens with the resolution of this war as a consequence of this particularly devastating defeat in Bakhmut.
And I think, again, we should just emphasize the underhandedness of the media framing of this story. The New York Times here, that's two stories we called out in a row, really trying to, I think, make a open-minded person arrive at a different conclusion than the truth, frankly. All right, more Rising right after this. Stay with us.